So, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, good evening for tonight's lecture. I'm Ludger Hagedorn, working here at the Institute for Human Sciences as a permanent fellow, and I'm happy to welcome you for tonight to the lecture by Professor Keith Krause. Is that pronounced the right way? I always have a tendency to say Krause. Okay, by Professor Keith Krause. I welcome you for this lecture on behalf of the Institute for Human Sciences, the IWM in Vienna. I especially welcome you also in the name of the Institute's rector, Shalini Randeria, who unfortunately cannot be here with us tonight, but who extends her very warm greetings to all of you, and especially, Keith, to you, as colleagues from Geneva. Professor Keith Krause is a political scientist by education, working in the field of international relations. As already mentioned, he works as a professor of political science at the Graduate Institute of International and Development Studies in Geneva. And at that very same place, he is or used to be the director of the Center on Conflict, Development and Peacebuilding, if I'm well informed, for very many years, from 1999 until 2016, if my information is right. But he is best known, I suppose, for a long-lasting and highly sustainable work in another field, namely as the founder and program director of the Small Arms Survey, shortened SAS. SAS is an independent research initiative that monitors all aspects of armed violence and small arms issues, with the aim of hopefully providing some analysis that may be helpful and may support governments to reduce armed violence and arms trafficking. I emphasize may support and may help because obviously this needs the government's will, which we probably cannot presuppose for all of them. SAS, the shortening, also reminded me of the shortening for Scandinavian Airlines. This is the first thing that came to my mind. You know, the image of Scandinavian Airlines as this very relaxing and cool carrier, cool and safe carrier. This is the image that I think that they want to prevail. And this SAS actually has to tell a very different story, very unsettling stories of the distribution of arms worldwide. SAS publishes an annual review of global small arms issues. That is, it monitors the production, the legal and illegal transfers of arms, brokering effects that the arms have, that they cause on human beings and generally, national and international measures to deal with these kinds of problems. From the very many publications of Keith Krause, I'd just like to mention an early book that he wrote, Arms and the State, Cambridge 1992, and another book that he edited, Critical Security Studies, University of Minnesota Press, 1997. He is the author of very many pertinent journal articles in the field. And as I said, and I think this is really your main contribution to have originated this initiative of the SAS, which is very, very visible, highly visible through its annual reports. The topic for the talk of tonight is between predation and protection, violence, order, and the insecurity trap. And if I would try to sum it up in two sentences, I would say, yes, we can agree. There is a long-term and general decline in all forms of lethal violence, but some states are caught in what Keith Krause calls an insecurity trap. So why is it that there are some states that are not capable of providing security and order as a public good for their citizens? I think this is somewhat the leading question of tonight. We do our lecture tonight in cooperation with CEFRI, the National Swiss Research Program Agency, and we are thankful for this cooperation. And with this, I hand over to you for the talk. Welcome. We are very curious on what you have to report to us.
Thank you very much.
want to make sure that you have your sound on before I start speaking. What I'm going to do this evening is, first off, thank you for that very kind introduction. You may have noticed that much of what I've done over the past 2 decades has actually been part of a collective intellectual project, and most of the things I've worked on have neither my name nor anybody else's name on them. Your paper? I wasn't going to read your notes, it's okay. And so what I want to do is talk about some of the reflections and ideas and maybe puzzles that emerged from our work on arms and armed violence. And I'm going to give you some facts and figures along the way, and then I'm going to talk about, perhaps in a slightly more academic context, how we should think about precisely what we mean by this insecurity trap. And I'm going to focus on essentially violence, order, and the state, as well as the insecurity trap, because I think the state is sort of central to all of our reflections about this. So let me start, if this works, by laying out what my puzzles are. And it's not just why do some states provide public good of security, but actually what are the conditions that give rise to this? How is it that in some parts of the world we have pacific states that don't prey on their citizens, yet in others we have endemic predatory states? What is it that makes some states fight fewer wars with each other, arguably no wars in some cases, the so-called democratic peace hypothesis? And how is it that states create domestic order and provide security as a public good? Now, this might not seem like much of a puzzle until you actually stop and reflect for a moment that the overwhelming force and tools of violence, instruments of violence, or ability to wreak havoc that exists in modern states is unprecedented in historical terms. Not only do we have the possibility of nuclear annihilation and the superpowers controlling nuclear weapons, but the actual predatory capacity of the state, both for its own citizens and to wreak havoc elsewhere, is really unprecedented as the result of the expansion of state power between roughly the 17th and the 19th century. And I'm interested in knowing how we strike a balance between this overwhelming power of the state and the ability under certain conditions to create peaceful states. So what I want to look at, oddly enough, is the exceptions to the trend, because there are many scholars out there, Steven Pinker, Joshua Goldstein, and others, who talk about the long-term declines in violence. And there are lots of discussions, debates, and I'm happy to go into those in the questions. But I also want to look at what are the backwaters or the pools of insecurity that exist, even if there is a long-term trend towards diminishing violence of all of its forms. There are still many parts of the world, and I will show you a few of them, where this does not seem to be happening over the long term, over, let's say, the last 50 to 100 years. And we need to explain also the exceptions to this. So that's going to be the focus of it. But let's start with the good news, or the alleged good news, that comes from the so-called declining war thesis. Now I can speak very quietly and be well heard. So what do we know about the scope and distribution of violence in general today? This slide might be familiar to many of you because it forms the basis for the argument of the decline in war. I put a question mark behind it because if you look carefully at that, this particular upward spike doesn't suggest that war is declining overall. But what's mostly important about this slide is that it highlights the near disappearance of what is called interstate war, which is taking place along the bottom here, and the rise of internal, intrastate, communal, sometimes called ethnic conflicts. Now, so that slide suggests that what we have, because it starts way back in the 1940s and goes all the way up to 2016, that we have a increase, but after the end of the Cold War, a decline that is only reversed with a few major conflicts that we know are associated with the Arab Spring and the events of 2011. The curve is going back downwards, although I think you know, like all trends, these are difficult to interpret, and a trend in itself is somewhat meaningless. So this overall decline in war allegedly also is accompanied by, and this is not shown on this slide, a decline in the lethality of contemporary conflict. It is true that there are large numbers of wars that are occurring up here but they are relatively small in scale and in destructiveness. Now, I know you're going to say, well, there are some exceptions, and obviously the war in Syria that has been going on since more or less 2012 is extraordinarily violent, but compared to the most recent historical periods, which include such things as the 8-year-long Iran-Iraq war, which killed roughly 800,000 people, or the Angolan Civil War in the 1970s that was between 500 and a million deaths, or the Indochina wars in the 1970s. There are few very large-scale wars and relatively fewer people dying in conflict compared to previous periods, compared certainly to the 20th century. Okay, this is only one part of the picture though. And what I want to do is focus on what happens when we take seriously the shift from large-scale organized violence between states, which has been declining, to other forms, which here are captured by interstate wars, but then still other forms that are not shown here that include all forms of violence that occur within states. And here I'm going to draw upon a project that we did at the Small Arms Survey for a number of years, starting in 2006, that resulted in 4 publications. The first 3 were called The Global Burden of Armed Violence. And we started with a fairly simple question, which is, rather than just focusing on war, how are people dying from violence around the world? How many? Where? With what relative scope and scale? And how is this changing over time? And can we say anything when we step back and take a very broad and holistic look at violence? In order to do that, you have to make one particular move, and that is come up with a common metric to measure violence. And we borrowed from criminologists who think about homicide in terms of deaths per 100,000. So we did the same thing for war deaths and deaths in conflict. And then we had at least some benchmark, and I know that it's very rough, to compare lethal violence rates across all forms, from wars, large scale, small scale, to gang violence, to other forms of violence. And when you do that, this is the kind of picture that you get, okay? And these are obviously the darker red highlights places that have higher violent death rates. I'm not sure you can actually see this here, but it's above 20 per 100,000 are the dark ones, and it's between 10 and 20, and so on. The average violent death rate worldwide is somewhere around 7 per 100,000. And you can see that, of course, there are zones of relative peace where death from violence, let's just take Western Europe, is between 1 and 3 per 100,000. It's incredibly safe. Your risk of dying violently in Western Europe and North America is very low. It is not as low here as elsewhere. And we can think of some obvious reasons why the United States is more violent than others, notwithstanding one of them obviously being the presence of large numbers of small arms and light weapons. But the picture looks different elsewhere in the world. And what's very striking about this slide, of course, is that most of the really dark red spots are not places that are in active conflict or war. We've highlighted some of the most dangerous spots on this. Obviously, Afghanistan, Syria, Iraq, yes, we know there's a war going on there. But Brazil, which has one of the highest rates of lethal violence worldwide, is prone to all sorts of gang and urban forms of violence that make some parts of some Brazilian cities and some parts of the countryside as violent as war zones. And the same is true with several Central American countries, Honduras and El Salvador. So when we put this on a different picture and we just compare the rates, these are the roughly 20 or so odd, 23 I think, most countries most affected by violence. Only 9 of them, and I hope you can at least see them or make that out a little bit, only 9 of them are actually affected by armed conflict. And in the top, once you get past Syria, Honduras, Venezuela, Swaziland, El Salvador, all are more dangerous than Afghanistan. And then you go down the list quite some distance before you hit Iraq. Now those rates, I have more updated figures, but was unable to translate them in the table, and partly because we don't have good data for Syria. There's been some shifting between states, but by and large, the picture remains the same in 2016, 2017, and up to 2018. We don't have data for the most recent year. But according to the most recent overall report, in 2017, roughly 560,000 people died violently, but less than 20% of them died in war zones. So what are we to make of all of this? Well, One thing that is clear from the map, if nothing else, is that a lot of this violence is organized, non-random, and in some sense political, in a very broad sense of the term. It's not interpersonal violence the way we would think of it, as purely exchanges that occur either within the intimate family setting or between people who know each other, and it's much larger scale than things like street violence between strangers, et cetera, et cetera. So it's organized and non-random, and we need to try and figure out how this might fit together with the broader pattern of violence, and why, in fact, many of these states are in persistent insecurity traps. Places such as northern Nigeria, Mexico, Colombia, Sudan, South Sudan in particular, Pakistan, parts of Southeast Asia, the Eastern Democratic Republic of Congo, Venezuela, and elsewhere. So this gives me a preliminary idea of where to look for this insecurity trap, where it might be at work, and obviously for how long or why this is the case. Now, there's all sorts of ways of trying to come at this and explain lethal violence. And in my work, I have come across and tried to classify what I think are three general ways of approaching this. And this cuts across public health, criminology, sociology, people who work on politics, issues such as identity politics and group mobilization, those who work on individual psychopathology or situational criminology, et cetera, et cetera. They broadly come at this in three ways. They either look for large master variables that explain a degree of variance in violence. The most prominent of these is inequality. Does inequality both within countries and between states or regions cause violence in any way? The availability of firearms is a second one that is prominent, and issues such as state fragility, the so-called Fragile States Index that tries to relate levels of state fragility to phenomena such as violence. So that's one way to do this, is to try and literally find correlations in the large scale. Now there are others, mostly anthropologists and sociologists, who come along and look at this from a different perspective and say, well, each situation is unique. The pathways and causes of violence in any given context vary tremendously, and there's no generalizations that can be made. And therefore, there's also no particular recipes that can be followed in order to prevent or reduce violence. And I'm going to put that normative issue out front here, because I think the whole point of the exercise is to think about ways in which violence can be prevented or reduced. And I want to go for a middle ground, which is followed by some people such as John Elster and Charles Tilly and others, and focus on processes and mechanisms that are causal. So there are common causes that may exist. They may be found in different contexts across time and across space, but they are not generalizable to large kind of large N contexts. I don't expect to find these everywhere, but I do expect to find similar patterns elsewhere. And it's going to allow some comparison. More importantly, it allows me to focus on what I'm going to call the conditions of possibility. What makes the resort to violence possible or rational or even useful for various social actors. There are a couple examples, and I will talk about them later, which are usually associated with forms of rule, rent-seeking behavior on the part of elites, or neo-patrimonial distribution networks, or the capture of states by elites, and so on. Okay, so now let me try and unpack this. I've told you what the problem is we're trying to figure out, which is why are there these pools of insecurity and these sustained situations of an insecurity trap, and what we might be looking for, which is not some kind of econometric analysis of large N correlations or anything. So what is it that the state does? Because this conditions of possibility for violence depend critically on the institutions that are designed to provide or not security. So how can we think about the security functions of the state? And I've categorized this along four slightly overlapping pathways. And we could think of these in chronological terms. If you were Charles Tilly and talked about state formation, you would actually put all of these in some kind of temporal chain where they emerged not exactly sequentially, but overlapping. Where the first one, of course, is the goal of eliminating rivals for central power to create a Weberian monopoly, not just a legal but a practical monopoly. The second is, once you have done that over rivals, to suppress any kind of violent contestation that may not be aimed at capturing the state, but that disrupts rule and order, usually in the hinterlands through such things historically as banditry, or now large-scale gang violence or drug cartels or anything. The third is, can we reduce the abuses that the state itself perpetuates of its monopoly of violence? And then finally, in this Nirvana-like state, security is provided as a public good, as the state consolidates its monopoly, and we have low levels of all forms of violence, from interpersonal to the interstate. But they can be fitted together in some way. Now, I'm not going to go through, because I think it would take me far too long this evening, to actually go through every one of these in detail and explain how these mechanisms might work, or what processes would lead to elimination of rivals. But I'm going to do it in the context of some specific examples. And I'm going to illustrate the examples by classifying states on the reverse axis of these four kind of security functions. So the first thing we can do is invert all of these and say, what does the insecurity trap look like? It looks like the exact reverse of the security functions. The insecurity trap rests on the long-term inability of the state to eliminate challengers. It often is exemplified by large-scale contestation, usually in the so-called hinterlands or the countryside, but sometimes in large urban settings such as Sao Paulo or Rio de Janeiro, where literally the state is unable to provide order. One of the most striking things, I don't know if any of you have been to Rio de Janeiro, but if you pick up a tourist map at the airport, it shows the main parts of the city where the tourists go, and then it has these blank spots that are kind of green that make you think they're parks, but in fact they're not. This is where the favelas are. They're literally left as blank spots on the maps that are distributed to tourists, but they're also blank spots for the state in some respects, because if you decide you want to go into some of these places, and I have been in, of course, one of the safer favelas, but there's concrete barriers and iron walls outside of them, and the police are outside of this space. And when you go into these favelas, you know you are passing into a zone of control that is somebody else's, that is not the state's space. And it's only under very special circumstances that the state comes in. Of course, with the Rio Olympics, much of that got overturned, and there was an attempt to recapture territory that looked a little bit like war in many of these places. And of course, what happened was the people who created order or disorder in those places, the gangs, merely moved out until the police went home, or the army. And they have come back in many of these cases. And Rio is suffering from a wave of tremendous violence now. Now, this is one example. I'm going to give you a few others as we go along the way. But obviously, in every one of these cases, there's been a failure to generate forms of political order and institutions that provide security on any of these dimensions. And we want to think about why that might be the case, and how to unpack the processes and mechanisms that go along with this. But first, I'm going to do another exercise at classification, which is to give you my list of states that we might think are suffering from this large-scale, long-term insecurity. What does it actually look like? There are a lot of countries on this list, right? And some of them are mentioned more than once. I'm not going to go into the details of what the source of them are, but many of them we draw upon the 30 most violent states from that Global Burden of Armed Violence report. We look at conflict data from the Uppsala Conflict Data Collection Project, anything that they consider an armed conflict. We look at state violence, which is often not captured in obviously official homicide statistics, because police killings are not homicides, they are legal interventions. And although obviously American police killings have been prominent, there are many other parts of the world, particular parts of the Caribbean or Kenya and Nigeria, where suspected criminals are often shot while trying to escape, translation in the back. And there's very little oversight of the use of lethal violence by state agents. Almost nobody is prosecuted for this. And that can form a very significant proportion of the actual overall burden of lethal violence in some of those countries. So we have a number of countries that have suffer from these forms of state violence and broader forms such as torture, etc., and generalized state repression. And I've classified them along my 4 kind of general categories. It's not exhaustive. I can probably put many more in this list, but it gives you a sense that if we're looking for cross-national comparisons, we might want to try and identify some countries that appear in more than one of those. And I'm happy to talk about, not all of them, but I know a little bit about most of them on this list. Now, one of you might come along and say, this is interesting, but you've mashed up all sorts of different forms of violence and tried to give us a generalized picture of insecurity, when in reality there's not a lot that links those states that are suffering from contested monopolies, for example, where the state is unable to establish order, and those that are simply suffering from low levels of violence and repression and other forms of state authoritarianism. But I'm going to give you at least one illustration to show how these are linked and why it matters that we bring them all into the frame. And it is the start of the process of the so-called Arab Spring or the Arab uprisings, which of course begins when a street vendor in a small town outside of Tunis sets himself alight and commits suicide against the repeated harassment and humiliation that he suffered from local officials. So from his perspective, and I think from a human security perspective, he has been subject to violence of the state. Violence as violation of his rights, of his dignity, perhaps even physical violence of harassment and overturning of his street carts. And that in itself is not extraordinary, except that, of course, it leads to a chain of events that captures, of course, street protests that break out the next day in his city, spread to the capital a week later, and about a month later, the Tunisian president resigns and flees, and then we all know the rest of the story, more or less, with demonstrations from Libya to Yemen, throughout Egypt, resignation of Hosni Mubarak, and so on. We also know the tragic end, or at least the current tragic situation to these stories, but certainly if you start your explanation or your search for an explanation when there is a large-scale war, then you're missing the way in which these different forms of violence, in particular state violence, can act as a catalyst for other forms of contestation that can escalate. So violence is not just a top-down phenomenon in a Clausewitzian sense where it's the continuation of politics by other means, but it also goes in an upward trajectory, sometimes from very small events such as street protests or individual acts or the painting of protest signs on a school in Daraa in Syria, and up to large-scale violence that's resulted in more than at least 100,000 deaths in the Middle East. Okay, so this is the challenge here, is to try and provide an account that is not just satisfying to international relations scholars who focus on war, but also those who are interested in all forms of contemporary violence, because precisely war is not where all the action is at and not the most important now, but it by no means means that violence has disappeared. So I'm going to spend the next few minutes quickly running through some examples, not all of these examples, I'll pick one from each of them, to illustrate what kind of mechanisms we might be looking for across time and space. And I picked them as exemplars to make some very general points about the pathways by which insecurity traps are perpetuated, if you will, and created. So the first one of them is the focus on contested monopolies. And here I'm going to say a few words about Afghanistan. And there are many different mechanisms that we could find, but I'm going to focus on this particular one that is at play in many states of the world, and Afghanistan being the most prominent of all. It's a paradigmatic case of a state whose existence is not called into question. It's not about to disappear or be carved up, but in which central power has always been relatively weak, and different clan and tribal authorities and strongmen and warlords, or whatever labels you wish to use, claim and continue to claim the legitimate use of force in the areas that they control. So it is not just a civil war, as it were, between the center and the periphery or different parts of it, but there is also a very complex story about legitimacy and authority, where many of these peripheral and often tribal or so-called tribal or clan leaders exercise and maintain and control violence through networks and tribal affinities that are considered legitimate by many of the citizens that are living under them. It also, of course, has an economic or political economy dimension, that all of these groups are either controlling particular networks of trade. In some cases, it's drug trafficking and opium production in the case of northern Afghanistan, but it can be anything from trafficking of gasoline to taxing of humanitarian assistance to racketeering of any kind of marketeers and traders. And the result of this is a sustained oligopoly of violence rather than what we think of as the slow emergence of a Weberian monopoly. And here it's important to note, of course, economists will tell you that certain kinds of things, certain kinds of features of the social world ought to tend towards natural monopolies, right? And telecommunications might be one of them, and violence is certainly understood historically also as one of them. But the example of Afghanistan and the other countries that fit in that category, which would include places such as Burundi or South Sudan, large parts of Central Africa, or the Democratic Republic of the Congo, are countries in which there has been a sustained long-term oligopoly that appears to be stable and is clearly inefficient in the sense that it is not providing security for its citizens. Now, what does this mean for the long-term trajectory of state formation? Well, we can look at a couple of historical analogies. In the history of European state-making, countries that were unable to establish a strong central power, my favorite example is 18th century Poland, where the national army in 1760 had about 16,000 soldiers, but the Polish nobility had about 30,000, just as an illustration of where power actually lay. And of course, neighboring states, Russia, Austria, Prussia had 200 to 500,000 soldiers. Well, the history of European state-making is of state extinction of many smaller countries that were unable to generate consolidated central rule that could compete with what was occurring in their neighborhood. But now state extinction is more or less off the table. You cannot imagine, or it's hard to imagine, countries such as Afghanistan or Democratic Republic of Congo being carved up and disappearing because the sovereignty norm is so strong. And so we end up with an insecurity trap that is partly caused by the inability of the traditional, and often very violent, means of resolving this tension, which was to essentially have weak and oligopolies of violence swallowed up by larger neighbors. So we end up with a persistent and long-term oligopoly of bandits that creates, I think, a dynamic that is self-perpetuating. Okay, now the second mechanism I'm focusing on is one step lower than the challenge to the monopoly of states. So it's not it's not a case where the contestation is about capturing the state, or a civil war, or warlords who want to exercise complete and total control over all aspects of their territory, but it's rather an analogy with what Charles Tilly pointed out about the European 18th century, which is that until the great consolidation of Western states in the 18th century, there was marauding mercenaries, bandits, private armies, town militias, and armed rebels that repeatedly brought large-scale collective violence home throughout Western Europe. They didn't attempt to capture state power, certainly that wasn't what bandits were all about, but they threatened its claim to a legitimate monopoly. And sometimes this was of a semi-legalized nature. So policing was often decentralized through some kind of rough justice of whoever the local strongmen might be, and they could prey on the population as much as they protected it. And you can find, I think, an analogy with what is happening in many parts of Central America, and in particular Mexico, which is my current example now. There are, according to some of my international law colleagues, you could probably describe the situation in Mexico as an armed conflict in legal terms, because it involves the large-scale deployment of the army, more than 40,000 soldiers, on the territory of the state to combat drug trafficking organizations. Mexico itself was not very high on that list of most lethal countries, but that's partly because large parts of it, particularly the center and the south and some of the coast, are not violent. But I can assure you that some of the states in the north, around Jalisco and Chihuahua, and of course the border areas, are considerably more violent than many of the war zones that I pointed out, and they have violent death rates of 50 to 60 to 70 per 100,000. There have been more than 50,000 deaths, which is a good-sized war, well beyond the threshold of a few thousand that we see in many other conflicts. Most of them are between drug trafficking organizations, but a significant percentage are in clashes with state forces and with the armies. Now, what's important about the Mexican case is that some dimensions of this, the amplitude and scope of transnational drug trafficking, are new. But many of the actual institutional dynamics are not new and can be traced back to late 19th and early 20th century Mexican history, which of course had its period of decentralized violence with armed bands and armed bandits controlling large swaths of the countryside, and the quasi-legitimacy that many of these actors have. And so, in fact, today, drug trafficking organizations in northern Mexico supply in some parts of the countryside what we could call rudimentary services. And they're celebrated in music, the narco corridas, and spend lavishly in local communities, of course, at the same time as they execute the mayor, harass the teachers, close the schools, but they establish a form of order that creates a quasi kind of legitimacy for some of them. Now you could change the labels, change the issues, and you could construct a similar kind of description of parts of northwest frontier province of Pakistan, which is also subject to violent political contestation, where the state is in constant struggle with other forms of authority, legitimate or illegitimate, and many of these forms are violent. So when you read that there are numerous Islamist groups operating and they're all under the control of the Pakistani intelligence service, of course that's not true. There's a very complex relationship between the formal state and many of these actors, and these actors operate autonomously, conducting terrorist attacks against the Pakistani state and its institutions, local governors, etc., but also in the context of conflicts with India and Kashmir and elsewhere. And so it's a large-scale set of violent order that has been persistent now for several decades, and is, of course, most prominently on our radar after 9/11, but it was going on for many decades since then. There are internal borders in Pakistan where you have to have essentially a passport to cross from the tribal zones into the central area, which is also a sign of the way in which the state has a limited writ in this. The dynamic at work here was captured fairly well by Diane Davis, who worked on Mexico, and pointed out that many of the reform projects in Mexico, many of the democratic and post-authoritarian reform projects, actually had a side effect of undermining the strong state and the rule of law. Because one thing that democracy does, even as it trickles down to lower levels, and decentralization, is create competition, a great degree of competition and fragmentation for jobs, for positions, for control of particular bureaucracies. And this has exacerbated the bureaucratic conflicts that has prevented the government from undertaking things like coherent and comprehensive police reform. The reason the army is at work in Mexico is because the police are utterly and irredeemably corrupted. And this is easy to understand when the average salary of a police officer is a small fraction of what a drug trafficking organization will pay you to simply ignore their activities. Coupled with the threat that if you do actually try to do something, they will simply kill you or your family. So it's a very powerful dynamic that is extremely hard to break because the state is almost never able to generate sufficient legitimacy to reassure those police officers or to pay them or provide credible alternatives. And the same operates not just in places like Mexico and Pakistan, but in parts of West Africa, such as Nigeria, where paramilitary organizations fulfill the same kind of functions. Okay, the third thing, and I'm only going to talk about these four, is how do we actually imagine taming the Leviathan? How do we reduce the abuses of the state monopoly of power? Now, early modern states actually had little difficulty, or at least citizens had little difficulty escaping the reach of the state because it was quite limited in its ability to control, coerce, or repress its population. And one reason for that was because it ruled indirectly, as I point out there. It actually had mechanisms for taxation, tax collection, administration of justice that were highly decentralized and relied on privileged intermediaries, often nobles or sometimes the clergy or municipal authorities, et cetera, or so-called tax farmers in order to collect and ensure the state. And this was all very loose and had relatively little coercive power. So the potential for using force against the population was relatively limited because the state was always vulnerable to resistance, either from the very bottom by the peasantry or from the middle level when the nobles simply cheated on what was due to the central authority. Mass violence was not absent, but it was arguably much less prevalent. And so the scope and scale of state violence, and when it becomes an extraordinary problem in human history, is associated with the expansion of state power, principally in the 20th century. Tim Snyder's not here, but we know about his work on Bloodlands that focuses on the phenomenon of mass death in the eastern parts of Europe. We can add to that Turkish Armenia, the Holocaust, China's Cultural Revolution, mass killings in Uganda, the genocide in Cambodia and Rwanda, and a whole range of lesser predations. There's roughly 40 or 50 cases of so-called genocide and politicide that can be documented in the last 50 or 60 years. And of course, genocide is a particular legal term. Politicide captures much a broader sense of state violence. And roughly, according to the best estimates, and these are, you can see very rough, between 60 and 150 million people perished in mass killing in the 20th century. That's much larger than died in battle in war, right? So state violence has been the source, the greatest source of insecurity in the 20th century. In the 21st, it is somewhat lower, but still relatively widespread. There are at least 60 states in which more than 50 extrajudicial killings, which is one good indicator of state violence, have occurred in at least 1 year in the past couple of decades. So of course, not every state every year is subject to this, but many states have more than 50 extrajudicial killings in any given year. And this would include, of course, violence by state agents such as the police and so on. It includes what happens in the favelas of Rio, where, in fact, there's a famous film about this, about a particular police brigade that engaged in social cleansing, which was essentially the killing of undesirables on the streets, many of whom may have been criminal, but many of whom were certainly not, were simply vagrants, seen as troublesome, coded as all sorts of undesirables. And of course, what was most shocking about the film was not that it was made, although that in itself was shocking, but that the public response was not condemnation, right? There was public support for cleaning up the streets in that sense. And that was partly because, if you've been to some of these places, it created a pervasive sense of insecurity for individuals, because the criminal elements may have been present, but there was a sense that we needed to literally clean the streets. Now, I didn't pick Brazil as my example for this. I think probably the best examples come from the countries in the Middle East, contemporary Egypt, Algeria, Saudi Arabia. I would have said Syria and Iraq, but they are, of course, in a war right now. But they have been categorized or called by scholars in the Middle East as mukhabarat states, distinctly Arab twist of a surveillance state in which you have multiple forms of overlapping security institutions that have essentially perfected techniques of surveillance and control and fused it to direct and indirect exercises of violence, including, of course, torture, state violence, disappearances, etc. Egypt is a paradigmatic example today. It is not in the midst of a civil war. The political upheaval since 2011 have played themselves out in the context of what's called a high-capacity authoritarian regime. And public security, that is to say, providing security to the citizens, is sort of a distant afterthought against regime security and the maintenance of what many people call the deep state, which is, of course, the sort of military and political complex that has maintained order, not just prior to 2011, but after the brief interlude of the elected President Mohamed Morsi and so on. And of course, I think in the last couple of weeks, 15 people were executed and after trials that we would have considered hardly meeting any kind of Western standards of justice. The consensus among Middle Eastern scholars is that Authoritarianism of this highly resilient sort is a sustained feature of political life in the Middle East. And the brief period of optimism that followed 2011 has been followed by a deep, deep sense of pessimism across the region. Okay, the last thing I wanted to touch upon is the Nirvana-like state of providing security as a genuinely public good for all citizens. And of course, this was a relatively late development in the history of European state formation, because this form of personal and interpersonal security, when it did exist, usually came from the family or the neighborhood or even from the local lord or noble, and maintenance of public order was a highly localized affair. Delivery of justice was also often a highly localized affair. So petty criminals were identified and taken care of, quote unquote, with rough justice in the community. There was not necessarily a formal system of justice to deal with them. And often communities organized themselves to provide patrol and forms of public order, whether it was at nighttime or against particular kinds of threats. The police and the modern notion of policing, actually, when police first occurs in both German and French, it's actually about administering the affairs of the state. I think Foucault and others point out that it was first designed to ensure the security of market transactions and the fairness of weights and measures in markets. It had nothing to do with actually eliminating petty crime and protecting individuals. This is at least a notion that only appears in the middle of the 19th. Middle of the 18th or 19th century, when we start to get the contemporary meaning of policing as securing citizens sort of from each other, from crimes that may be committed. And this only occurs, we know in Britain, the famous story of the creation of Scotland Yard in 1829 and so on. And it really takes off after 1848. So it's quite late in the history of European state formation. And not surprisingly, by the same kind of process of slow development, policing is extraordinarily rare in this sense in most parts of the global south. So if you travel to parts of West Africa, as I've done, and you get outside of the capital city, you can find police stations in every town. You will find even 2 or 3 officers and a vehicle. The vehicle will not have gasoline in the tank, will almost certainly not have tires that are functioning, because tires are precious commodities. People can steal them. Gasoline is expensive. And the police don't have the infrastructure to respond to reports of crime. They don't have working telephones, or if they do, they're unable to respond. When they do respond, it's usually because somebody who calls them is able to provide, shall we say, payment for the services. On a lesser level, you can travel through many parts of Africa, and there's roadblocks in the entrances to towns, and you're stopped. They're not formal roadblocks, but the police are checking vehicles, and of course they're bribing people. It's often impossible to get through without small sums of money, but this is to supplement their income because they're often not paid at all. And the police officer, it was told to me, the police officer is just about the only person in the town who can afford to buy a beer every day. So their source of revenue generation is the fact that they have the authority to rent, seek on a low and local level. It's got nothing to do with protecting citizens against crime. And in fact, one of the things you discover is that rough forms of justice, including lynchings and vigilante justice, are prominent and operating in parallel to the police, whose responsibility in those circumstances is only to collect the dead bodies that appear in the market square rather than to pursue justice in any sense. I picked a case that I didn't mention here. I gave the African cases. Liberia is the one, and Burundi the ones I'm most familiar with, but Venezuela would probably fit the paradigmatic case today. Not large-scale drug trafficking gangs such as Brazil or Mexico, not a civil war, but the slow and progressive degradation of state institutions, including public security institutions, to the point where it now has one of the most violent, high levels of lethal violence on the planet. And the situation, as we know now, involves a standoff between the opposition and the government, and several days of blackouts, and you know what happens when blackouts occur. Large-scale petty criminality, especially in a situation of deprivation, soars. This is not a situation of interpersonal violence, right? Because the dynamics that underlie it are integrally connected to the capacity or the incapacity of the state to generate order. And in the case of Venezuela, most of this is traced not just to Maduro and Chavez, but to the popular revolts of the 1980s, which now take us back more or less 50 years, and riots in the urban areas that were repressed violently and resulted in the coup of 1992. In the 1980s, Venezuela's death rate was somewhere around the global average, around 8 to 10 per 100,000, and today it's 10 times that. Okay, so this is a quick overview, and I have not spent a lot of time on what I would call the sort of theoretical backdrop to this, because I don't think it's particularly important here. But what is important is to capture the sense that the red thread that unites them all, if you will, is that multiple forms of violence, not just classic armed conflict or high levels of gang violence or interpersonal violence, but multiple and hybrid forms have some very complicated links between them. And what unites all of this, at least in the perpetuation of the insecurity trap, is the dysfunctional role of state institutions and the persistent inability to follow some of the pathways, the positive pathways that are outlined on those slides that occurred in different Western European and other states in the global south over the past few centuries that allowed us to escape what would have been a pervasive insecurity trap for everyone. I think I can end on a simple note here rather than diving into the theoretical side of this, but actually the practical side, which is one of the international community's principal responses in fragile and post-conflict settings is to embark on large-scale security sector reform projects. They've been doing this since roughly the late 1990s, for more than 20 years. Billions of dollars have been spent in all parts of the world on security sector reform and security sector governance. And the security sector is conceived of exactly the way I have presented it. Everything from police to the army and all the institutions in between. Almost all of these efforts have failed and had extraordinarily limited, when a policymaker says limited success, they're usually saying failure in a euphemistic way. And what's, I think, important here is to step back from these programmatic and development assistance investments and ask ourselves, what are the real processes by which we might help to create order, rather than simply going in and say, right, let's create a national police force, or let's resize the army, or let's put in place civilian oversight of the budget, because all of these measures, and I can talk about some of the detail, have actually failed, sometimes with tragic consequences for the people involved. In Iraq, the United States deployed a model of community policing that was actually based on what they had done in Kosovo after the war there. And in the early 2000s up to the late 2000s, they had trained more than 67,000 recruits at a special center. They spent billions of dollars training police recruits in Jordan. They were lightly equipped, badly armed, poorly trained, and were like community police officers who you might see on the streets in places like this. And they became targets of insurgent attacks. And by the late 2000s, more than 4,000 of these police had been killed and 8,000 of them wounded. So there were very real consequences for getting it wrong in terms of what you needed to do to create and generate public order. And I think that's a salutary lesson that should not be repeated in any other places. Thank you.
Does it work here? Thank you, Keith, for this impressive overview of what you call the insecurity trap, and maybe the questions that we will have to ask at the end also is maybe some ways of how to get out of this security trap. This is probably what we can say for the discussion now. We have some time for the discussion. Please allow me to start with something that does not directly contest your presentation of tonight, but I would like to bring in something else of your work that I mentioned in the beginning, namely your long-term work in the field of the small arms survey, if you allow me. If you tell me this is totally misleading, then you just give a short answer. But I would be very happy to bring this in because I find this very impressive. You started off by outlining these 4 factors, the 4 most important factors for lethal violence. You said inequality, poverty. I tend to take both of these as like one complex, inequality and poverty. This is a political issue. This is not what we are discussing tonight. Then you had two more factors. One, the availability of arms, and second, what you called state fragility. You have outlined very impressively the consequences of state fragility tonight, but what you do in your small arms survey, I think, has more to do with the availability of arms as well. And this afternoon I was just reading a bit, very bit, into the service that you're doing, and that really impressed me a lot. And if we are speaking about the availability of arms, I mean, it is obviously an undeniable fact that the availability of arms has to do with lethal victims, and there is a direct correlation. I think you would agree to that. You mentioned it very briefly at one point when you said, why is the United States somewhat different? I mean, it was obviously not one of the worst cases, but somewhat different than Canada, somewhat different than Western Europe, for example. I think this has to do with that. How would you weigh these two factors? I mean, as you understand, I just try to bring in a different strand of argumentation for lethal violence. And is it, I mean, would you say it is much more important to only speak about the fragility of states? Or is it actually, would you say these are two equally important factors? And if you look at the numbers, I mean, I will give the word to you now, but if you look at the numbers, I think it is really impressive, and maybe this is also, I mean, this is your work. You could also say a bit about this, but because the numbers of for the availability of arms is I mean, some of you might be familiar with. Maybe you want to mention it. I don't want to go into this now. Please.
Okay. So part of the reason why I'm now focusing on the pathways that lead to violence or the conditions that make it possible is because there is no simple relationship between arms availability and violence. So we started in a similar exercise to trying to calculate how many people died violently. We also wanted to know how many guns there were around the world. And that took a long time. We have a figure, it's somewhere around 1 billion. I won't give you the exact numbers, but, and then where they were, right? Now, not surprisingly, there are a lot of guns in the United States. There are more than 300 million, roughly a little less than one per person. And if you simply do the math, you would realize that if the rest of the world was armed as heavily as the United States, there would be several billion small arms and light weapons, not just around 1 billion. So the US is a complete outlier with sort of one gun per person. I come from a country, and I am now Swiss, which also has a high rate of firearms ownership. It's roughly 40 or so per 100 persons. I did not check the Austrian figures or others. 30, thank you. Yeah, in many other European countries it hovers between 20 and 30. Gets a little higher as you go eastward and northward, so Finland and the Scandinavian Nordic countries have relatively high levels. Canada is up in the same area as Switzerland. But these countries all have very low levels of violence compared to the United States. In the violent countries that I highlighted, such as Brazil, firearms ownership is relatively low. And in parts of Africa, where you have this image of countries that are awash with AK-47s, it's even lower. And this is not hard to understand when you think about it, because a gun is a unproductive capital resource, right? They're not free. You can't get them for a bag of chickens or a goat or whatever. They're $100 to a few $100, and it would be, unless it is productive for you and generating income, it's a capital investment that is not in any sense productive. You'd much rather have a cow than a gun. When you have 10 cows, maybe you think you need something to protect them with. Or if you happen to have predatory intentions, a gun can actually be very useful. So in many cases, in parts of Africa, this is anecdotal but very solid, that police officers often rent out their weapons on the weekends to the local bandit. So you rent it out for a few dollars, the local bandit extorts money, gives the gun back on Monday, So guns can be useful and productive, but there's no relationship between the actual numbers of firearms and the violence, because otherwise you would expect Brazil to be very low violent. And that's partly why I said these large, now this is a message that the National Rifle Association would love, right?
That's what I just wanted to say.
I know.
I mean, they would like you.
They would like me. But that's part of why I say these large N searches for correlations across time and space, that doesn't really work, right? Precisely because it leads you to these kind of conclusions, which is that there's no relationship between the availability and the use. Now, but when you zoom in,
I mean, sorry, but there is a correlation. I think this is
no.
There is a correlation with other incidents like the cases that we have, like school massacres and so. I think this is obvious that there is a correlation. Or would you even deny that?
I would. School massacres, we have a small data set on those, which, this is not the happy SAS Airlines story, right?
Yes.
These ebb and flow along pathways that have to do with what criminologists will call emulation and imitation. And that's very clear, right? that they come in waves, they ebb and flow. I don't have the exact figures, but the number of people who die in school massacres is very small as a percentage of the total. Roughly 30,000 people who die from firearms violence in the United States. So for every school massacre, you have the same number of people dying every day, but one at a time in states across the world. And some people have published, wall charts of how many people were shot and killed that day. Now, in the United States, if you zoom in on one country, then you have to ask yourself, well, what are the factors that go along with firearms? And one of them is, of course, inequality, race. So there are many more guns in the south of the United States than elsewhere. It's higher violence. The South has a historical, I hesitate to say this, but cultural violence that's quite different than in other parts of the country. And not surprisingly, arms use is co-related with such things as alcohol, availability of ammunition, the type of firearms that are out there, and so on. So, in the United States, you can have pistols more easily. You can't often have them here nor in Switzerland, where many of the guns are military-style firearms that all the young men have as part of the militia service. So it turns out there's always a set of other factors and a complex chain. And that's why I don't want to do, and we have never done, the study that their NRA would, which is just do the correlations. Just take every country, all the guns, all the violence, and show that the scatter plot shows nothing, right? Because that conceals more than it actually reveals.
I just wanted to bring this in because I think it has so much to do with what your long-term work is, this small arms survey. So this is the time for your questions, comments, criticism, if there is any. Please.
I just wanted to ask, like you say about this, the trap that, especially in countries like Afghanistan and Africa, where you said like a lot of it has to do with like historical institutions, that there are tribal mechanisms to the society, and that these warlords have always kind of throughout history been the leaders of these areas. And do you think that, as like looking at it from a Western European and American kind of viewpoint, that we kind of put like these ideas of our institutions on these places, even though what we see as, like you said, as a police service is not necessarily the exact same in these places? So do you think like you said, like these companies or these corporations spend a lot of money trying to influence these countries by just repeating what happens in Western Europe and hoping that works? Do you think it's more of like a cultural and historical thing, that maybe we should look at it as in a different light and try and do something new and something different about it? And obviously that's like a difficult question, but sometimes I think a country that may have been like this for 1,000 years can't just easily be influenced by a Western country saying, oh well, in our country it works like this, that there's a police force and everything works in order. And like, do you ever think like countries like Afghanistan, that they will become what we see as like a peaceful society, or will they develop somewhat differently?
Yeah, that's not only is that a hard question, but it's also a politically sensitive question, right? So a lot of my other work at the Center on Conflict Development and Peacebuilding looked at post-conflict peace building. And so that's where these two things came together, because I was interested in what are they doing in the security sector in peace building, and why is it not working, essentially. And Afghanistan is not the only case. And not surprisingly, when you unpack the international practices, the blueprint, if you will, of what is often called liberal peace building, it follows a fairly simple Western template. It first involved the idea that you had to have elections. Right? That was the first step. And then you would put in place a stable institutional structure. You would reform the bureaucracies. In some cases, you would create police. So after the Burundian Civil War, there had been no national police. So they took ex-soldiers and they created the Burundi National Police Force, and so on. And most other places, it was an attempt to downsize or right-size armies. So there's three things that I've learned from this. The first is that local actors can almost always capture these international programs. So they have their own interests, and if those local actors happen to have interests in control or repression or rent-seeking behavior, they will find a way to do that. And this occurred in, for example, South Sudan most prominently. There was great optimism, new state, end of civil war, fair amount of international resources, and then suddenly the efforts to downsize the army kept failing. All the soldiers that were supposed to be demobilized kept showing up on the payrolls or moved into other bureaucratic institutions. They created a new institution because that's what kept the peace, right? Was maintaining these sorts of networks. So the first thing was capture. The second was that the local, and I don't mean the formal state, but rather, let's say, the communities, often had very different perceptions or expectations, very low expectations, of what the state would provide for them. So it's not just enough to create a police, but if people have other alternative forms of seeking justice and providing security, they're not going to abandon those until they're absolutely certain that the new one works. And of course, that's a very difficult hurdle to cross over, because the new one might be captured, but more importantly, the basis of trust for that. So they created these Burundian National Police, but there was no reason for anybody to actually go to them, and they often feared them, because a man with a gun in a town, prominently with the authority of the state behind him, that's somebody you don't want to mess with, right? And then the third was that the international practices that were put in place often did not correspond at all to our own history of institution building, right? And so there's a whole part of this project that I haven't done, which is involved in unpacking, well, how did we get ideas about community policing? How did we manage to get the state to stop doing things like using its armed forces to break strikes, as it did up in the 1930s and 40s? And what was the process? What was the exact process of contestation? Because unless you have that, it usually involved, in some cases, let's say it was left-wing contestation to prevent the army from being used to break strikes. Well, in the absence of some kind of social force in the local context, it's hard to put these restraints on state power. So, will Afghanistan stay in its perpetual state? Yes, but there are different, first off, no place is static. And you can, over time, create new interests and new kind of coalitions, but these are very fragile, and they often are subject to manipulation. So, programs for educating girls and women and recruiting pilots, female pilots, and female police officers, in fact. There's some also tragic stories there where Afghanistan recruited a number of women police officers who were killed precisely because they were women, yeah. So it's a very difficult struggle, but I wouldn't give up on it, but it has to be very locally embedded.
Thank you. So on your one of the first maps, Europe looks very peaceful and very wide. But there is something happening on the eastern borders of Europe, and I'm thinking in particular about the three cases of separatist regions backed up by Russia. So in the North Ossetia in Georgia, and then Transnistria in Moldova, and the so-called Donetsk and Luhansk People's Republics in the east of Ukraine. So what's happening there? I was wondering if you've done any research or thinking about those regions, and if so, what were the questions you were asking and the conclusions and analysis that you can share with us? Thank you.
Well, we did some specific work in the Ukraine and eastern Ukraine. The big picture, leaving aside those three regions, the big picture was that in the aftermath of the collapse of the Soviet Union and the reform processes of the 1990s and the early 2000s, there was actually an upsurge in violent criminality, partly because state institutions were in flux or deeply compromised or eroded. And that actually started to come down. So in many parts of that map, if I did it over a 20-year time span, you would see a process of slow convergence. Most of these countries have not hit sort of Western European levels, but there is a convergence. But this is actually, good news in general terms for most of these countries. There are a number of spots, though, not just the ones you mentioned, where they're deeply, and I'm thinking mostly about parts of Southeastern Europe, where a sort of a corporatist, corrupt / elite is controlling state institutions and is very resistant to reform, including things such as the police force in many countries. But this is mostly economic in nature, rather and not captured very well by lethal violence, because levels of lethal or personal violence are going down. Now, with respect to Transnistria, I haven't looked at that one recently, but it was understood to be a bit of a black hole for smuggling, for production of weapons that didn't have serial numbers, for example, which is very helpful if you don't wish to have them traced subsequently, and things like that. But it's very small, and it's also small scale, and it appears to have less impact because the demand side of the equation, certainly the local demand, has not increased, and stability is being ensured. Eastern Ukraine, this is a different story, right? And you have a war, if you will, so-called hybrid war, whatever that particularly means. You have OSCE observers who are regularly in situations of either being shot not at, but over or near or by, and incidents such as that. And that is obviously, I think, an interstate conflict, if you will, being conducted under a different kind of guise. The story of the Ukrainian state inability to generate stable order is not just confined to the eastern parts of the country, though, right? There were issues about the state institutions throughout the country, and I'm not an expert on the Ukraine, although there's probably somebody in the room who is. So there was also questions about whether the Ukrainian state is capable of establishing and slowly instantiating a form of order that would then allow it to have a different position vis-a-vis the eastern parts. So there are potential spots that are creating insecurity and instability throughout the region, but over time it's been progressively contained. That's how I would describe it.
Hello. Thanks for your presentation. It's got a lot of information, so sometimes I got a bit lost. I'm working for the Global Initiative Against Transnational Organized Crime, so we've been following your work as well, because we're also based in Switzerland, Geneva. Yeah, just there at the Neumark. What I'm interested in is the double standard of the Western world. Even though I agree with you that we cannot draw a correlation between the availability of the small arms and also the stability of the region and the country. But, I guess one of the greatest suppliers of small arms is they from the Western world, right? The US, Germany, Austria, and so on. So on the one hand, they're saying that they're trying to stabilize the conflicted regions, but on the other hand, all the private actors are also state actors. They're supplying the arms and weapons to these conflicted regions at the same time. So yeah, what's your take about it, and how would any solution for this to improve the stability of the conflicted regions with high level of lethal violence? Thanks.
So you were correct to point your fingers at the Western states that are the largest arms suppliers. I'm only going to speak about the small arms and light weapons part of this, although most of the arms trade is major conventional weapon systems and controlled by essentially the big five: Britain, France, the United States, Russia, to some extent Germany, and then China. So it's not quite the same for small arms and light weapons, but it's close enough. With the coming into force of the Arms Trade Treaty, there was some hope and expectations, and this is now 3 years ago, that common standards would be in place that would at least inhibit the transfer of arms to not just conflict zones, because most countries had some kind of restrictions on that, but in particular to areas where there was what's called a high risk of diversion, okay? Because most of the weapons that are used by illicit actors, whether it's criminal actors or state agents or paramilitaries, state agents operating illegally, et cetera, most of these come from state arsenals. It's not like the Austrian, can't remember the name of the Glocks. It's not like the Glocks are being sold to the drug trafficking organizations in Mexico, right? But they are being sold to legal purchasers and then leaking out. And leaking can take many forms. It can be theft, it can be bribery, it can be passing it along, et cetera, et cetera. And so for my mind, the most important thing was to actually capture this diversion part of the process so that a company can't say, well, but we sold it to legitimate purchaser X. And after that, well, it's not our problem. There's been some progress on solving that problem. Not much, but it's early days for the arms trade treaty. But I do think it's that chain of diffusion that needs to be tackled. And of course, diversion is also a local responsibility as well as an exporter's responsibility. So they have to have end user controls to make sure that who they sell it to remains in their hands. But then there also has to be local checks and balances in place so that the guns remain where they're supposed to be, if they're supposed to be there at all. And of course, some of the bigger scandals associated with this came through Iraq and Afghanistan, where of course the re-equipping by the United States Army of the Iraqi army and Iraqi police, the guns were just flowing out the back door. And the Pentagon at one point admitted they'd lost more or less 1 million weapons. And well, we know where all those have ended up, right? And that's a very unhappy story. If you don't have control over what you're doing, then why are you selling these in the first place? So I think that's a big issue. There are other issues in the global south. Brazil sells and produces a lot of small arms and light weapons. It used to appear that a lot of them were exported to Paraguay. And it turned out that actually this was a paper fiction. Guns never actually went anywhere. But there were export permits for guns to go to Paraguay, and there's papers that were stamped and people who were bribed at the borders, et cetera, so that the guns could then be released onto the domestic market in Brazil and into the hands of criminal organizations. So a couple of producers there got their hands slapped because they were, of course, feeding domestic criminality. So the market is not just exports between states, but it's also what happens internally and who bears responsibility all along the way. So I would focus on diversion and try and capture that. My hope anyway.
Just one comment,
Yep.
though, but the local actors, they don't have the capacity to, double check, because you say this is one of the solutions.
Well, if they don't have the capacity, then you shouldn't sell the weapons, right? So that's the first thing, right? Don't sell guns to people who can't safely secure and store them. And when I say people, I mean institutions, whether it's armed forces or military forces. Some governments, under some circumstances, have figured this out and invest in stockpile management and security. So in Kenya, for example, which had a leakage problem in its northeast corner where ammunition was being supplied to pastoralists and so on, decided they need to actually have a comprehensive system of inventorying and tracking so that guns were not lost and ammunition was not leaked and then used in disputes among pastoralists and so on. And they received international assistance to do that. And so they acknowledged they had an issue. They needed to address it because it was creating insecurity on their border zones, et cetera. So there are some success stories, but yeah, you have to work with the country. The same has been true in some police forces in Central America. I know that Heckler and Koch was charged with illegally selling weapons to Mexico. I don't remember exactly the details of this because I've only seen the headline, but Mexico has imported a lot of small arms and light weapons. And where do you think the drug trafficking organizations are getting these weapons from? They're not buying them on the global market and smuggling them in, right? They're getting them locally through the same process of bribing the police officers who are threatening them. It's also a way of acquiring weapons. And so if the state can't control its own arsenals, then of course it's not going to be able to solve this larger problem. And Mexico is hardly a uncapacitated state in that respect.
We take the two neighboring countries of Venezuela and Brazil. I think you very nicely outlined that in your talk. All of what you call the fragility of the states, there is very, very many different stories to be told, often almost not interrelated, almost contradictory, I would say. I mean, this brings me to the question, first of all, that's what I mentioned in after your talk, what is the way out of the insecurity trap? And I suppose, or I'm afraid there is that many answers as there is individual cases maybe. Maybe you can correct me on that. So what is the answer, for example, in Venezuela? What would be the answer in Brazil? And coming back to the three main factors that we were speaking about. So availability of arms, we have spoken about that. Fragility of states, that was what your lecture was about. And poverty and inequality. Can you speak about lethal violence in Brazil without taking into account poverty and inequality? And what does this mean in comparison to Venezuela? Because I think in Venezuela, poverty, inequality, for some time at least, I mean until recently, was maybe not that much of a problem. It became a problem now. So, I mean, I'm just trying to outline two very different trajectories and what is the way out of the insecurity trap.
So the first thing I'd say is that just as I don't want to do the large N correlations for the NRA, I think each situation is unique is also not the answer, right? So there are some patterns and pathways. This is the argument of processes and mechanisms that we can uncover. I don't think Brazil is on the same pathway as Venezuela, for example, but there may be some parts of this that are analogous. With respect to the question of inequality, we know that inequality is a background condition for violence in particular countries, Brazil being one of the most unequal countries in the world. But of course, there's no straightforward, again, relationship between levels of inequality and levels of violence because it's both relative and absolute. In a country that has high relative inequality but low levels of poverty, then you don't have the same propensity to violence as one in which you have high levels of inequality but high levels of absolute poverty, right? Now, Brazil under Lula dramatically reduced absolute poverty, right? Did not necessarily have that much impact on violence. Colombia, not Venezuela, I'll take the Colombian example, on the other hand, has been quite successful, both in major cities and independent of the end of the war, right? 80% of the violent deaths in Colombia in any given year of the last couple of decades were not in the war. They were gangs and criminals in Medellin and Cali and Bogota, et cetera, et cetera. But there was a concerted set of efforts to improve urban security. It depended a bit on the city, to put in place sometimes quite simple and progressive things, such as street lighting. Other cases, urban transport systems that reduced predatory violence so that people could anticipate the regular arrival of a bus and that there were lights near the bus stops and that this would actually facilitate people moving and reduce, turns out streetlights help reduce violent crime, not surprisingly. And things like restrictions on alcohol sales after a certain time period because somebody, lo and behold, studied when most of the violent use of firearms was, and it happened to be, particular times of day on weekends. And so if you stopped selling alcohol a little earlier, you could. So a whole set of micro mechanisms that fitted together in ways in a laboratory of a city, for example, that you could actually achieve some progress. That all depends on a state that is not fragile, right? In that sense. Colombian state has its own weaknesses, but it was able to generate the resources, and not just money, but the resources in order to put in place these kinds of policies, which are standard packages of sort of public health and crime prevention and so on and so forth. So the first step is, do you have sufficient resources? Venezuela does not, right? If anything, the story is of the disintegration of public institutions in general. They stopped publishing crime statistics. The person who was collecting them and bravely publishing them, the head of the Statistical Bureau, was fired a few years ago because she, not surprisingly, was publishing bad news that the government didn't want to hear. So a few NGOs are collecting data from morgues and stuff like that. But if you're not even able to get a sense of who is being who is dying where, when, under what conditions, and by what means, then you can't design an evidence-based policy. So the fragility component of this isn't some sort of macro level notion that the state is fragile or about to collapse, or the central government is unstable. By that account, Britain is highly fragile today. Had to get a Brexit comment in. But it's actually about fragility on the very basic institutional public service level. And I think that's what I would focus on. Before I would undertake large-scale reforms of the police, I'd say, do you have the capacity to ensure that the police could even remotely know and react? So put in place the capacity to react, to do something, and then create the police. Ensure that you can pay them before you hire them, for example. Turns out often they get hired or created in Eastern Europe and nobody pays them. So you need to have that kind of ongoing institutional structure. And it has been built. I'll take Colombia as a success story. We would agree. It has been destroyed in Venezuela, notwithstanding whatever social gains may or may not have existed. And it's ebbed and flowed in Brazil, which I think right now is a fairly tragic story of a country that actually had made some progress on all sorts of indicators, but failed to convert that into sort of sustainable institutional development.
So if there is no more urgent questions or comments, I'll stop with one final question. And this is your illustration that followed us throughout the PowerPoint presentation. Did you choose it randomly, or what is the message entailed? Where is it taken from, and what? I mean, is it just the peaceful message?
Yeah, I'm trying to remember. I did know where it was taken from. It's actually a real photograph. We used that in a few small arms survey templates, in part to suggest that there has to be a positive message to this, right? I mean, you don't study these things because you're interested in guns. People always wondered about that. No, I'm interested in violence and insecurity, and guns were one pathway or trajectory, but by far not the only one. So as a political scientist, I was interested in the entire range of this. I think that picture came from the Middle East, if I remember correctly, but I don't remember exactly in what country. And it was essentially a random shot that some photographer captured, and we used it in various things. So the dove of peace is like the owl of Minerva, though, in some respects.
So thanks to all of you for joining us tonight for this talk, and most of all, thank you, Keith Krause, for your lecture of tonight. And this is your applause. Thank you.